again, an official welcome from my side, Conscious Capitalism and Conscious Business, kind of trying to cover the European community of what is conscious capitalists, conscious business people, and like-minded academics. And there's a special pleasure. I have David Sloan Wilson here. Everybody's forgiven if you don't know his name. I had the same sensation 2 years back. I was invited to New York to a conference that dealt with humanistic management and how to actually, in some of its academic roots, it was a combination of many academics, some few business people. And there I met David Sloan for the first time. We'll discover his world, which we'll dive into in a second, speaking about evolution and why it is highly relevant, at least that's my humble opinion after reading 2 of his books, for business, specifically for conscious business. But then off the stage second, let me do 2 or 3 sentences to David himself. He may be the most elder, mature person on the phone, being born in 49. And to cut your ample scientific career short, you're a biologist. You call yourself an evolutionary biologist. I guess that's a branch and a specific specialization within biology, and ran through several universities, very distinguished, and you published a lot, and wrote a lot, et cetera, and you had many academic and research positions at several institutions. Now, not only in the US, I read as well you spent some time in South Africa, and then went all over the US, California, Michigan, et cetera. Now, the key to his work, and that's exactly the trigger that we're going to get into, is extending evolutionary theory to various fields, including human behavior. And I'm now diving into something very specific, business. Okay. Well, he co-founded the Evolution Institute and the Pro-Social World, their nonprofit organizations, and wrote many books. I'm going to give you a copy of some of his most prominent books. I think I counted down to 6, 7, 8, which are listed on your LinkedIn website. So you see, David is actually very much of a scientific person, and yet he likes to make it very tangible and practical, which is great. That makes you really a conscious thought leader for conscious businesses. Now, let's start actually to give us a quick introduction, David, and I'm asking you to stay to the biological context for now, and then we're going to dive into the business context. Give us your first 3 minutes, I guess, on evolution theory. Pick us up on the most recent summary of what evolution theory is about, way beyond what we may think, survival of the fittest, genetic mutation and selection. There's much more to it.
Right. Well, first of all, thanks to everyone. And secondly, I'm overjoyed to see Raj Sisodia on this call, my good friend Raj Sisodia, who is the one who introduced me to the conscious capitalism movement. And I'll definitely be drawing upon you, Raj, as we go along. But to begin with my 3 minutes about evolution, when most people hear the word evolution, they think of the word genes, genetic evolution. And when I was a graduate student way back then, it was indeed the case that the study of evolution was focused almost entirely on genetic evolution, leading such things as human cultural evolution or human personal evolution, personal development, completely out of the picture. And my special topic as a biologist was the evolution of cooperation and altruism. How can do unto others, how can extending yourself, cooperating with others, survive and evolve in a Darwinian world? So that is a biological question. Cooperation exists in nature, and cooperation also doesn't exist in nature because special conditions are required for cooperation to evolve. And then something else that happened during the 50 years of my career was that the study of evolution gradually expanded beyond genetic evolution to include all processes that involve variation, selection, and replication. That's the core ideas of an evolutionary process. Organisms vary, things vary, those differences make a difference, and the successful strategies tend to replicate over time. And so these ideas that were developed in evolutionary biology suddenly became applicable to all human cooperative endeavors. That would include religion, but it would also include economics and business. And so for the last 15 years, really, I've been studying these human topics, economics and business, from this distinctive perspective. And it was maybe 3 or 4 years ago, Raj, that we met, introduced to each other by some American members of the conscious capitalism movement. And this is sometimes, this happens to me. It's a rare event, intellectual love at first sight. And so I think Raj and I just hit it off immediately and have been working together ever since. Most recently in a 6-week workshop that we taught out of Tech Monterey, where Raj has his Center for Conscious Enterprise Center, that went through this over a 6-week period. We called it From Friedman to Darwin, and how businesses really need to change paradigms from Milton Friedman's shareholder value model, basically, to something that is very well represented by the conscious capitalism movement and other movements such as the B Corp movement and other essentially pro-social business philosophies.
Thanks. And thanks for highlighting your connection back to Raj. I remember when I first, it must have been 3 years ago, somehow through the conscious capitalistic grapevine, somebody told me, oh, the recent books or the most recent work of Raj is very much influenced by an evolutionary biologist. The name wasn't dropped. And I thought that, oh, this is interesting. At one time, I'd like to know this person. And here we go, David. Let's set the stage a little bit further before we go into business. Give us maybe an example, not yet in business, that people can grasp on where the approach on evolution and the learnings on selection, not yet going into group within group and between group situations and multi-level selection. We don't go there yet. In which way can some social phenomena, and you use an example of religion, for example, be explained under the evolutionary lens? I would like people to grasp why you are so clear about the approach of looking at social developments under the evolutionary lens explains so much. Use an example of religion, maybe.
Well, that's a good prompt because there's an inner and outer dimension to generalized Darwinism. With cultural evolution, what we need to know is that we all have our genes, but we also have our meaning systems. And because we are such a cultural species, there's 2 streams of inheritance. There's the genetic stream found in all species, and then there's the cultural stream, which is very distinctively human. Other species do have cultural traditions, but not to the extent of humans. And so thinking what's inside our head, our symbolic meaning systems, and these go by many words, our worldviews, our religions, our theories, basically everything inside our heads, which organize what we attend to, organize our perception, the information we take in and how we process it, are all things that dictate our behavior. So there's an inner dimension, just like our genes are inner, and then they result in how we behave. Our meaning systems are inner, and they also influence how we behave. Religion is one subcategory of it. And so I've studied religion for 15 years, and most religions, most enduring religions, are impressively well organized to basically foster strong communities. That should really come as no surprise. And if you're self-religion, then you know that religion in some ways is all about the formation of strong communities that are highly pro-social internally. Often they're highly pro-social towards others, although of course this can result in between group conflict. And so us versus them, these are all things that come into the picture. But I think the most important point to make here is that as we think about all of our groups, our business groups or any other kind of groups, because we're always interacting with groups, there will be an inner component of how we conceptualize these groups and our basically our preferences for these groups. And then there will be an outer component of how do we structure our social environments in order to realize our pro-social values. So equal time spent working on inner and outer. And of course, that's represented by the conscious capitalism movement And again, not to come back to Raj again and again, but if you were to list Raj's books, there would be a balance between inner and outer with a big emphasis on the inner.
Let's dive exactly on that distinction, inner and outer. And in your wording, you often refer to within groups and between groups. And what I thought maybe one of the key phrases, it's a quote that you use, and I like to explain it, is selfishness beats altruism within groups, but altruistic groups beat selfish groups. All else is commentary. I think that may be a great summary of all your thinking and your observations. Unpack this for us.
Yeah, sure. And I think that all of this is what I want to say is elementary. So even if you're, this is something that anybody can understand, should be common sense, and really is. So first common sense statement is that prosociality, when you extend yourself towards others, when you do good things to others or to your group as a whole, you're making yourself vulnerable in relative terms to other individuals who do not do that. And so all forms of prosociality have a strike against them, in the sense is that they place the prosocial individual at a relative disadvantage compared to free riders, people who accept social benefits without accepting the cost, or people who downright exploit cooperative behaviors. And so prosociality starts out with a strike against it. That's the selfishness beats altruism within groups part. Thankfully, groups of prosocial individuals robustly outcompete groups whose members can't cohere. And so that's the altruistic groups beat selfish groups part. And a business book on this topic, one which I'll bet a lot of you are familiar with, is the book Give and Take by Adam Grant.
Grant, yeah.
And that's a wonderful book. And what he says is there's three business strategies. One is giving, give, taking, take, or matching. I'll only give when I know that I'm going to get in return. And so Adam asked the question, who does best in the business world? And his provocative answer is, the givers do the best and the worst. The givers do the best when they surround themselves with other givers, and they do the worst when they're surrounded by takers. And there you have that dynamic in a nutshell. And he gives many, many examples of both the advantages and the dangers of being a giver. And I guess the last point I'll make is that the extent to which giving is dangerous or safe depends very highly on the social environment, the culture of the group. And so when businesses think about their cultures as they should and they need to, then it makes all the difference as to whether the culture of a group, its rules and institutions and practices and so on, protect pro-social behaviors or actually create free play for the takers. So another way to say this is that this is a more nuanced approach to competition. So obviously, competition is a key concept in business and in economics, and often it's represented as just competition is unambiguously good. Let there be a free market. So let competition take place, and good things will emerge. And so, but what evolution tells us is that it's more complicated than that, and that competition can have very toxic consequences when it results in takers winning and givers losing. And so if you don't understand that, then you're going to be setting up competitive environments which are actually very destructive. They're destructive for the company, and they're destructive in what the company does outside of its own borders. And so we have to be more intelligent about how we structure competition. That's what a lot of this is about.
Let me leverage on the word competition. Now, when I introduce, or you introduced, just quoted the phenomenon of how people behave within groups and how between group behavior, the little understood was that it matters the type of behavior within the group, not necessarily being the most competitive and not being the most selfish, because that is a negative route, at least detriment to succeeding as a team, as a group, to a joint objective, versus coming together as a team and not playing to the utmost competitive game, while it helps the between group competition. Give us that view on in which specific environment does competition make sense, and in which specific environment, I understood, within groups, a purely competitive behavior makes less sense.
Well, I sometimes use the game of Monopoly to illustrate this. If you look at the game of Monopoly, as it's usually played, it's a single group and the members are competing with each other. And there's no scope for cooperation. If you want to win the game of Monopoly, you're not cooperative. The only context for cooperation is when the current losers cooperate to gang up on the current winners so that they can then turn on each other. And so here's a case where a social environment that favors competition, pure and simple. Now imagine playing a Monopoly tournament where the trophy goes to the team that collectively develops its property the fastest. And so now, by the way that you've constructed the social environment, it's all about teamwork. There's no sense in which you would compete with a member of your same group. Everything is about competing as a group, and yet there's no context for cooperation among teams. And so where cooperation resides depends very much on the social environment. We see this in team sports, by the way, which is another really good way to think about it. Of course, team sports is all about between group competition, but there also is competition within teams for such things as salary and the like. And there's a lot of research that shows that in sports teams where there's a lot of salary dispersion, in other words, a lot of the money is going to star players and things like that, they actually function less well as teams. They win less than teams in which there's a more equitable distribution of the benefits. And another thing about teams is, of course, they're refereed. And so it's intense. It's an intense form of competition, but the competition is highly structured to avoid the disruptive forms hitting below the belt. And so in many ways, what we're striving for is let there be competition. I mean, the idea that cooperation is different than competition, that's not what we're talking about at all. Let there be competition and let it be fierce, but let it be refereed. And let's make sure that it doesn't result in negative externalities up the scale in terms of the impact that the groups have beyond their borders.
Let me try a summary here. At least that's a summary that I did for myself, and it kind of clicked for me. And let me test that to make it very clear for the audience, the takeaways. When I thought about evolution and it's playing out, I thought about many individuals competing. And then that sense, old-fashioned, very limitative sense of surviving as an individual human species is one thing. You were very clear that you introduced, well, society exists in a number of many individuals, and that sense of competing is a relevant way on how to actually behave, but it equally consists of small groups. And you were tireless in your book, the two books I read, that is society and the way how it functions best and the sense of cooperative behavior being a more successful behavior because of these two building blocks of society, not just as individuals, but as well as small groups. And both necessarily operate at a different kind of behaviors to optimize their own outcome. Did I get that right?
You did, and I'm really glad that you're taking the conversation in this direction because it takes us back to what we spoke of earlier with inner and outer. And if you look at the conception of people, the Friedman connection, the neoclassical economic conception of it's called Homo economicus. And what it does is it's centered on the individual person. It assumes that the individual person has self-regarding preferences. Basically, they're self-interested, and that's the way they're constructed. They're trying to maximize their self-interest, which in a business context is usually some sort of financial gain. If that's the case and you're trying to run a business, then how do you get the interest of the individual to align with the interests of the group. That's called the alignment problem. And then, and typically the financial incentives is the main thing that you think about. That's the main tool in your toolkit. How about the profit maximizing business? So what's its impact? And then the metaphor of the invisible hand is invoked to say that when all firms are trying to maximize their profits, then somehow the invisible hand of the market kicks in, and that ends up being for the common good. So there's the one paradigm. If that's what's inside your head, if that's your conception of human nature, then that will basically drive the way you see the world and the way you act in your businesses. It might or might not work well, but that's just your common sense. Now, in contrast to that, imagine the idea that individuals never lived alone in our entire history as a species. We always lived in the context of small and, for the most part, cooperative groups, even when those groups were warring,
social.
Even when those groups were warring with other groups. And in those groups, individuals were always doing things together, surviving and reproducing together. They always had social resources to fall upon in addition to their personal resources. And against that background, if you take an individual and you remove them from that group context, in other words, you treat them like Homo economicus, their brain and body interprets that as an emergency situation. This is why social isolation and loneliness is the most toxic thing that can happen to a human being. To be lonely and socially isolated is a greater risk factor than smoking, obesity put together. And so that makes perfect sense when you think of human nature as something which is inherently groupish, as opposed to inherently standalone individual. And so if that becomes your understanding of human nature, and then you think about how do I structure a business, it leads to an entirely different strategy set of how you work with individuals and what you do in order for them to cooperate. In other words, it results in a new common sense. And that common sense is, I could list that, but I'll let you lead the conversation, Constantine.
Thank you. Let me summarize this actually with a quote that I found very clear. And again, it gave me a lot of ahas. I'm trying to help the audience here. In your book, Pro-Social, Using Evolutionary Science to Build Productive, Equitable, and Collaborative Groups, you describe that selfishness may win within a group, but altruistic cooperative groups outperform selfish ones. And I think that was a key insight that I had, like an aha. The other aspect that I'd like to elaborate on is, you call it the problem of goodness. That is that this idea of people that are altruistic, that are giving, using Adam Grant's example of givers, that within a group setting, that if the social fabric of that group and that entity is appropriate, they're actually more successful. And that actually, from an evolutionary perspective, explains why ethical, altruistic, compassionate behavior, while in a more narrow-minded, evolutionary, individualistic sense, people may say, if you're always giving, if you're actually working only for the benefit of others, you will actually lose out. But within a group context, this kind of good behavior prevails. Is that correct?
It's correct as long as there's appropriate structure. And here we once again get to inner and outer. And then when it comes to outer, how we actually act, being in a group is not automatically good. Even a small group is not automatically good. Small is not automatically beautiful. There must be appropriate structure. And that structure, let me list the appropriate structure. This is based on the work of Elinor Ostrom. And I've done research. I've done research on this. And let me actually do something with this audience that's similar to the actual survey study that we did. Imagine a business group that you know well, and then I'm going to list a number of what's called core design principles, basically, or the structure of a group. And I want you to evaluate this group that you know well, how well it implements these core design principles. And I also want you to evaluate how well the group you have in mind functions as a group. So the group you have in mind might function well or poorly. So keep that in mind, and then see how well this group implements these core design principles, which I will now list. Number one, does your group have a strong sense of identity and purpose? Is it a meaningful group? Do we know who's a member? Do we know what the group was about? So it's having a group that has well-defined boundaries and is meaningful, has the members of the group have a strong sense of purpose, is the number one core design principle. Two, benefits proportionate to cost. Is it the case that what members give to the group, they get back from the group? Or is it the case that some members of the group are doing most of the work and other members of the group are getting the benefits?
A quick note, David. I'm going to
Yes?
copy the 8 principles. I prepared that in the chat.
Awesome. Okay,
So
there they are.
actually,
there they will be.
I'm clicking hit.
Okay, so you can actually
It tells me too many signs. I need to cut the message. Keep talking.
Okay. Number three, fair and inclusive decision making. Is it the case that all members of the group have some kind of say in how the group is structured, what the group decides to do? Or is it the case that some members of the group call the shots and other members of the group are influenced, but they don't have a say in the decisions that affect them? Number four, monitoring. If we agreed to do something, we need to know, did we do it? So is agreed upon behavior monitoring. If it's not being monitored, all bets are off. Graduated sanctions. Is it the case that if you're not doing what you should, there's some correction? And need not start out nasty, should start out mild and friendly, but also must be able to escalate when necessary. And ultimately exclusion, inviting the person out of the group, is necessary in some cases. And while we're correcting for misbehavior, let's reward good behavior. And in some of the best functioning companies, they talk about a 6-to-1 ratio of praise and reward for good behavior compared to correction for bad behavior. Conflicts will occur. They must be resolved in a way that's respectful of both parties. The group must have elbow room to do what they do, authority to self-govern. And then finally, interactions among groups must obey the same principles as interactions within groups. The principles are scale independent. So with apologies for going through it so fast, in the survey that we did, we asked participants of the survey to bring 2 groups to mind, a business group and any other group of their choice, any other kind of group of their choice. And the result of the survey was, number one, a very strong correlation between how well a group implements the core design principles and how well they function as a group. And I hope you can see, just on the basis of this conversation, why that would be in terms of our selfishness, altruism dynamic. In a group that implements these core design principles, it's really hard to misbehave. I hope that you can all see that. This group is safe for pro-social behaviors. You can extend yourself in a group like this and you will not be exploited. And most people, when they find themselves in this kind of a structured group, they love it because they want to be pro-social and they just blossom. And so the study showed that indeed there was a strong correlation between implementation of these core design principles and how well the group functioned. And the study also showed that business groups, compared to other kind of groups, had an average deficit in all 8 core design principles. Business groups as a category.
Some empirical type of study, or?
Yeah, this is what the study showed.
Okay.
And so isn't that extraordinary that business groups should be deficient in these design principles required for the performance of all groups? There's an average deficit in all 8 core design principles, with the biggest deficits being autonomy. Basically, many people, not most, can't do their jobs as they see fit. They don't have enough autonomy, decision making. They're being bossed around basically, and they're not being influenced by not having a say in the decisions that are made, and the meaning of their work. They don't find their work very meaningful. With the three biggest uh, biggest deficits. Now a final thought there, Konstantin, because I hope this is where we go next. So we get this average difference, but of course there's still variation among business groups. And so if we look at the highest performing business groups, we make two predictions. Well, we make one prediction. The reason they're high performing as businesses is because they have managed to implement the core design principles. That's the
to a higher degree or better degree.
What to a better degree. And so there's spectacular examples of businesses implementing the core design principles, and among them are the businesses that Raj has featured in the conscious capitalism movements. Companies like Barry Wehmiller and Raj's book with Bob Chapman on why everybody matters, or everybody matters, and so on and so forth. So anyhow, back to you. But
well, I'm going to do just a half a step back because I care to help the audience understand how we got here. And maybe I do so because I'm an economist by training. So I did do some reading on Elinor Ostrom and how these principles got about. I just want to send some context so you get the relevance. Is she did research and just got the Nobel Prize on her research on commons. The commons is a limited pool of resources that a defined group, a set of group manages, and they have to coordinate and agree. This is the case for fishermen who obviously cannot exploit unilaterally, selfishly, the fishing grounds, because that would be to the detriment of the entire group. This is true in mountain kind of regions where access to green grass for many participants, farmers, needs to be limited. So she observed how these collectives operate, and she found these 8 principles under which, exactly what David articulated, under these conditions, they were able to actually outperform other setups. Other setups, remember, would be privatized or centralized steering. And what these 8 design principles actually say is that a certain setup, autonomy, and self-steering around these 8 groups were the significantly more successful setup. Well, I think, and this was another aha that I had, is that what then evolution theory observed was, because groups and the in-group behavior is so important, and its cooperative group benefiting behavior is so important and outpaces individualistic self-cherishing, self-benefiting behavior. Well, the social building block of small groups, you took actually these core design principles and observed they fit to any kind of group in order to be successful. Did I paint that context correctly so people get an idea on where this all came from?
Basically, these what Lynn Ostrom discovered for a certain kind of group, common pool resource groups, which you described very well, applies to all cooperative endeavor. So it doesn't matter what the kind of group is. It might be schools, churches, businesses, you name it. If it requires collective action, and they all do, then what you'll find is, in the first place, those groups vary in how well they function. That's what Ostrom found. Not that all common pool resource groups implement these principles, quite the contrary. Common pool resource groups that she studied varied in their, that's why she was able to derive them in the first place. So if we look at businesses, schools, any kind of groups, religions, churches, any kind of groups, first of all, you'll find that they vary in how well they function. And then if you look at the high performers, the top end of the distribution, the bold prediction is that the reason that they're successful is because they have implemented the core design principles. That's an empirical prediction. It might be wrong, but it's something that we can test. And all of the testing that we've done confirms that hypothesis, that these core design principles are very general, and any group should want to learn about these and implement them.
Thanks. let's get practical. And as we get practical, let me invite again the group. I didn't get any questions yet, maybe because we lost them. Maybe it's too interesting to foster question on their own. Please chip in, guys. In order to get practical, to your knowledge in some of the studies, what are companies? You mentioned one, Barry Wemler. Okay, so pretty known company in social capitalistic circles. What are companies or maybe practices, specific things you've seen in the last 5 to 10 years, putting a spotlight on it, where you say, these are great practices where companies actually successfully used exactly this approach, and it showed?
Well, one point to make is that the companies that end up employing these core design principles, typically never heard of Elinor Ostrom. They didn't learn it that way.
Okay.
They didn't learn it in business school, that's for sure. And so they came by these practices by a million different paths. And so Bob Chapman and Barry Wehmiller, he's a religious man. And so he was really implementing Christian principles. And he describes his insights as a series of revelations. And then every person who ends up in this space basically has a different story to tell about how they got there. And that means the specific way that they implemented it often varies. And Elinor Ostrom herself made a distinction between these functional principles that every group needs and how they're implemented, which can be very contextual. So this is not like a cookie cutter solution. Every group has to experiment with its own arrangements in order to know how best to implement these core design principles. But I'm going to just focus on one part of this, which I think is leadership training. And so, of course, so much about businesses has to do with leadership trainings, and the conception of what a leader is part of this internal meaning system, part of it. And so often a leader is someone who's conceptualized as someone who's having a lot of control over what takes place. And then so basically it's an authoritarian structure, which is therefore part of the problem, that the leader can do what he or she wants. And so therefore you want to educate the leader to do it accordingly. But if you look at groups that implement the core design principles, these are distributed. This is inherently participatory. In groups that implement the core design principles, everyone is involved. And this is actually sometimes called a leader-leader model. And one of the most interesting books on this is Turn the Ship Around, about a nuclear submarine captain who implemented these principles in a nuclear submarine. And
that's very interesting.
I'll say, I mean, if ever you thought a command and control structure was needed, it would be that. But he speaks very eloquently. His name is David Marquet, I think, and he's actually become a business a consultant. But he talks about a leader-leader model. Yes, you do need structure. Sometimes that structure looks hierarchical, but no matter where you are in that organization, there is a domain in which you need to function in a leadership capacity. And as he would put it, if you're merely following orders, then that's a waste of your resources. And in every person's domain, there is a domain in which that person knows more than anybody else, especially in a moment like in a battle situation. And so he developed what he called a leader-leader model. And although that's not the only model, I think the common denominator is what the leader does. And often strong leadership is needed. So this is not an argument against strong and decisive leaderships, but they must coordinate the process. They must function to implement the core design principles. And there also must be bottom-up feedback. If the leader is not doing that, they need to be corrected just as well as in fact, more than anybody else. So this is sometimes called a servant leader. And I'm sure that term is familiar to people in this group, is that on the one hand, you're functioning in the capacity of a leader, but your duty is to serve. And if you're not, then, and if you're not basically orchestrating a participatory process, then your group has not implemented the core design principles. That's your job, is to help them
Yeah.
do that. And so I think if you look at the leadership training that takes place, you'll see that. I mean, the thing about the conscious capitalism movement is that most of these groups that are on this call have found their way, I'm betting, to the high end of this distribution. They're doing these things probably. And as Raj will say, I'd actually like to invite Raj to speak a little bit here, is that what he found useful about what I brought to it is that
Mm.
this was a way of explaining what he had already come upon. Raj, why don't you see it much better than I do, if you would, if that's okay,
Oh.
Constantine, to have.
Yeah, let's do it. I'm planning to have Raj again next year when he publishes his new book. So chip in, Raj, before we go back to David.
Of course. Yeah, no, I'm always happy to be in David's presence, and there's always something new that I learn. And as he mentioned, when I discovered his work a few years ago, I said I've never been this intellectually excited and stimulated, perhaps ever, not even in my PhD program in business, because you learn theories there that are kind of soul deadening. Oh, we're supposed to be homo economicus and only care about, and that's the sort of the foundation on which everything is built. And it doesn't really inspire very much, inspire us. And when I learned about his work and how this can explain across so many disciplines and across species, for that matter, so much of behavior and what succeeds and what doesn't, I realized that here was the piece that in a way had been missing in conscious capitalism, which was a movement that was born of practice. It was born of observing companies that succeeded by a broader definition of success, as we were putting in firms of endearment, not just financially. Financially came at the end, actually, just as a check on whether these companies were viable. But they were succeeding in a broader way in terms of uplifting society and positively impacting people's lives. And so we extracted those principles over time and found more examples of those. But we really were lacking a theoretical foundation for it or an explanation for it. Are we just finding a set of companies that are aberrant and they're running contrary to human nature? Or actually, is there something deeper there? And so I think what this provides is what some people in academia have said. I know one of my colleagues, my department chair at Babson, actually once said that conscious capitalism is atheoretical. Like, where's the theory, right? And at one level, it sounds amusing to say, we know it works in practice. Now, can you make it work in theory? But actually, it's a very practical thing to have a good theory. And one of the other things that we covered in that doctoral seminar that we did together, that David mentioned, was that social sciences are unique in that the theories can be very dangerous or very positive, because they can often become self-fulfilling. If you teach a theory to impressionable undergraduates and then it gets reinforced time and again, they pretty much becomes their worldview and their way of making sense of the world. And so they start behaving according to the precepts of that theory. And so there's studies that show that students, maybe not Constantine, but many who study economics, actually start to behave in a more selfish way, in a more short-term way, and a more materialistic way, because they're told that's what it means to be a human being, right? So danger, these kinds of theories. There's a classic article by Sumantra Ghoshal, Why Bad Management Theories Are Destroying Good Management. Because people read Michael Porter and say, okay, it's all about competition. Everybody's a potential threat, Or agency theory, you have to bribe people just to get them to do the right thing, essentially, is what agency theory says, right? Etc. And so this provides a very robust theoretical underpinning to say, why do conscious companies succeed? And at first glance, it says, wow, these companies will be eaten alive by their more ruthless competitors, because those others are willing to do things and that these companies are not, and they will cut wages, and they will do all the things and squeeze their suppliers, and they'll just dominate in this jungle of a marketplace. And what you actually find is very consistent with David's work. And the line that Constantine quoted, I think, up front, that altruistic groups significantly outcompete and outperform groups that are rooted in selfishness, right? And that's what companies are. Companies are kind of built on this whole foundation of selfishness being kind of the operating system for everybody, scaling up from the individual to the organization. And that's simply not an accurate reading of what it means to be a human being. So for me, this provided that missing link of explaining conscious capitalism and why it succeeds. And once you have that, as you know, once you have that, then you can deepen it. When you become conscious of something, then you can go further.
Indeed. Thanks.
Thank you, Raj.
Thanks for that.
I always love hearing Raj has come through his voice.
David, let's move back and up one level. I'm going to invite Hendrik Jan, known to many of us. He's a co-founder of Conscious Business in Europe, kind of a brother, sister to Conscious Capitalism. I'm going to invite him to ask a question itself, taking it up one notch to an economic level, to a system level of what your theory approach applies. Go ahead,
Awesome.
Hendrik.
Yeah, thank you, Constantine. Well, I love the information and the context and the mindset. It needs to take this to a next level. And that's also where my question comes from. In the end, we want to get to a conscious business economy where all businesses are conscious, because that's simply the right way to do it. And I think we pretty well know what it takes for a business to become conscious. But what path forward would you see to get to a conscious business economy? Is it something which also has to be heavily government induced with the right institutions and everything? And there's also research on that, of course. Or do we need simply a tipping point in the right number of companies which are acting in a conscious way? Or a hybrid thing, or how do you see that?
Yeah, well, that's great. Thank you for taking the conversation in this direction. And I want to say more than one thing. One thing I want to say is that there's like this battle for the theoretical high ground in economics. So part of this involves that high intellectual battle. And so my work with Dennis Snower on rethinking the theory, I have a series of articles, Rethinking the Theoretical Foundation of Economics, with the economist Dennis Snower. So we're working at that level, and we need to work at that level. I've also started to work with libertarian economics, and that's so fascinating because I think there's a sense in which this is very friendly to libertarianism, by the way, but I'll just leave that dangling as a kind of a tantalizing prospect. But I also wanted to affirm the other thing you were saying, Hendrik, is that this can also be done bottom up and needs to. So there's some sense in which in any locality, I mean, it leads to such things as like, if we're going to be consciously evolving something, let it be the bioregion as a unit, not just a human-centric unit like a nation or a city. That's human-centric. Let's let it be a bioregion, and then we can bring in nature and biodiversity and ecosystem services and agriculture and wherever people live, whether it's towns or cities or wherever. And then let's take the stakeholders, all of the stakeholders. That includes government, markets, and so much more, what they call a third sector, of all the different groupings that exist, and then work on their evolution. And typically that the ideal mix for that is what I call bottom up meets enlightened top down. So on the one hand, this can take place without anyone needing vision, just to each and every one of you as an individual. Think of all the groups in your life, all of them, your partners, your families, all of the groups in your life. Imagine learning more about this stuff and then applying it to all the groups in your life, including yourself as an individual. You don't have to ask anyone's permission. You can just do it. In addition to that, if there's any organizations that are out there, whether they're governmental or philanthropic or whatever, that can actually, in leadership style, or when I was talking about leadership, that's not just an individual leader within a group. There could be a leading organization who is in a position to capacitate this, then it can work even better. But it probably will be happening in this way, and especially in the current political climate. It will not take place at the national scale. It will not take place by international bodies. And so it has to be some combination of bottom-up meeting, enlightened top-down, wherever that can be found.
Thank you very much.
Let me add to that, and maybe you can give it another facet. One thing that I found interesting is that everything that you found out in evolution theory, proclaims, etc., makes it clear that the basic assumption that self-optimizing behavior optimizes the result of the group is a fallacy. And that's exactly what economics business is based on. Now, this would be, I'm simplifying, libertarian or utilitarian, that utilistic function of I'm optimizing my own behavior, and the social benefit for everybody is maximized. And you're saying this is clearly wrong. The extreme other opposite would be there needs to be a top-down planning, kind of directional, that gives clear boundaries and already anticipates because it knows what the best outcome could be and should be. Now, clearly what you outline, and help me to summarize it maybe to get the gist, is a third way. It's a third way on relying on groups and then multi-level selection to actually play out their evolutionary strength of behaving cooperatively in groups. And this clearly I understood is a third, more successful way than either of the two extremes, correct?
Yeah, thank you, Constantine. By the way, remind me of when we stop. If we have a hard stop on the hour, or
3 minutes. We do
3 minutes. Okay, good. So
it's a kind of a wrapper question here.
Yeah, so I think that, so just to summarize, laissez-faire doesn't work, centralized planning doesn't work. The only thing that can work is some process of experimentation. It's basically a form of conscious cultural evolution. We form goals, let them be pro-social goals. We try stuff out, we select what works, and then we do that again and again, and again. And there's a whole piece about this, about adaptability. We've been talking a lot about governance, but also the ability to change, not the ability just to be cooperative and to be well governed in the present, but the ability to be flexible enough to change is another huge piece of what we're doing. And it leads to a new model, I think, and this is a good final thought, of continuous improvement, basically. That's a familiar concept, but that's what companies need to do, and what business schools need to help companies do, is to engage in some process of continuing experimentation, both within their organizations and the larger economies that those organizations are participating in. And this is seldom happens in my experience when I deal with business schools and so on. I find the consulting relationship is one which is just like, very marginal. It takes the form of, leadership programs or this or that, in which there's not nearly as much ongoing collaboration. So there's I think a model of continuous evolution, multi-level evolution, which is needed, and which is very different than what most companies are accustomed to. And so that's something we need to think about and to adopt, is how do we adopt this experimental approach in which we're communicating with each other. And we're working very actively. Raj and I are, in a business school context, along with other people like Michael Pearson and lots of great people in the business school management environment. Jan Pfister in Finland is another major a major person, and then beyond, between groups. That's where we get to local economies, bioregions, and so on and so forth. So just think in terms of continuous engagement, something that never ends and that you never want to end because you're so well connected to like-minded people. That's the big picture that we're reaching for.
Thanks. I know this was a wrapper question, and given this is so powerful, this is a big answer. I have to be honest, I needed to read your book twice in order to swallow all its implications, and I'm not as intellectually sophisticated as Raj. I'm not saying to please him in terms of all my studies and the scientific work, far inferior. But I had a similar, almost awakening moments when I read your work. I said, wow, now I have a theoretical framework on why this actually makes sense and why collaborative altruistic behavior at a group level, etc., is superior. And this is why you actually offer the evolutionary learnings in order to do that. And as a trait, I give the last word, Raj, before I close.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I don't know if you read Atlas Hugged or not. You might have read some of the other books. You did read Atlas Hugged.
I did.
If
Thanks
somebody
to your
wants an
recommendation.
approachable and fun and a kind of a compulsive page turner, I recommend Atlas Hugged. It's gonna teach you while it also entertains you. So
yeah.
Well, I think that, I mean, Raj, first of all, thanks to everybody for their interest and to people like Raj and Konstantin for really seeing the value in this. We're working so hard to create the architecture for this. So I think that if anyone wants to learn more, then get in touch basically, and then there's ways for involvement that so that we can make this as easy as possible for you to make this happen. That goes for Raj and myself, for Konstantin, and that's what it means to be basically collectively evolving our future.
Yeah. The book that I started on, there's many. I gave you the guitar list. It's this one, This View on Life, Completing the Darwinian Revolution. And with this, my dear friends in Europe, maybe somewhere abroad, thanks, David. Thanks to everybody who participated. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for your participation. And I gave you the conversation that we're going to have in something like 8 weeks with somebody from Steward Ownership. Actually, a very, very interesting, a specific way how to help companies in their legal and governmental setup in order to stay true to their purpose and actually avoid the pitfalls of the financial markets. With that, thanks everybody, and have a good rest of the week. Bye-bye.
All right. Thanks, everyone.